Across the world, the time period between 500 CE and 1400 CE is generally known as the Dark Ages. Part of the reasoning behind the name is that there was no central political power in Europe at the time. There were kingdoms with borders, but they were very weak. As such, it is important to ask and understand, in the absence of a strong political state, who and what provided order for European societies. During the late years of the Roman Empire, landowners, and large ones in particular, took more control of their lands and their workers in order to stay self sufficient despite the political weakening of Rome from barbarian invasions and weak, corrupt governments. As Rome, the strongest central political power in Europe, fell, manorialism became a popular way for peasants to find work and food for their families and for powerful men to become self sufficient. In the 5th and 6th centuries, merchants were attacked from land and sea. The lack of secure trade meant that civilizations overly reliant on trade struggled. There was huge loss of jobs, money, and power. Cities were destroyed by barbarians, which meant rich nobles moved to rural places and peasants followed. There were no governments or leaders because no people lived in the cities. People took up subsistence farming, and most of the educated, being previously mentioned rich nobles, left, which meant a major decline in education. The Germanic barbarians couldn't read or write. Only priests and nobles were literate. In fact, there were no written languages, only verbal. There was a loss of common language, as Latin, the language of education and the official language of Europe due to Rome, was no longer understood. New dialects were started with different groups. In fact, two of today's biggest languages, French and Spanish, were regional dialects. The fall of the West Roman Empire from barbarian invasions caused new kingdoms that weren't united, making them unable to protect themselves from invasions. This caused the rise of feudalism in Europe. Feudalism was a political and social system of the Middle Ages based upon relationships of mutual obligations. It was a system of extreme political decentralization where public power was held and exercised in private hands. The system was derived as a result of no strong central government and was based upon the exchange of land for protection. A grant of land was called a fief. The individual who granted the land was known as a lord, and the one who received it was a vassal, also known as a knight. The exchange was made official in a commendation ceremony, in which a knight was granted land for military service, placing the two parties, the lord and the knight, in a feudal relationship. The knight would then swear an oath of loyalty to the lord. Knights have become one of the more recognizable parts of the Middle Ages. They were generally mounted warriors who protected their lord's lands. As noted previously, they were given lands for their services. Chivalry was a code of ethics followed by these knights, which included honesty, fairness in battle, and proper treatment of women. Now, manorialism was a slightly more advanced version of feudalism and more complicated. Manorialism was an economic, agricultural system by which the lord of the manor relied upon the labor of peasants who worked as a state or fief. Manorialism gets its name from the manors and estates that fiefs were broken into. After the onset of manorialism, there was little to no trading due to the fact that it was unsafe to leave the manor, a complete turnaround from the trade-centric kingdoms of pre-feudal societies. Because of this, people became self-sufficient. Everything essential was produced in a manor: clothes, shoes, shelter, and food. To achieve this, the land on the manor was shared by a lord and several peasant families. The lord kept 1/3 of the land to himself, and the remaining 2/3 was farmed by serfs. And serfs is a term for peasants who lived on the lord's property. The serfs gave the lord some of their crops, farmed his land, and paid taxes. Manors were generally comprised of a manor house, which was the lord's living area, cultivated lands, woodlands for hunting, pastures for cattle, a priest's house, a mill, and an oven. Ideally, such manors were along a river. This could provide cleaning for the lord, as well as a water source, could serve as a moat, and could even produce fish when other food sources failed. Manors also practiced an early form of crop rotations. The farms were divided into 3 fields, but only 2 fields were planted every year, so the third could regain its fertility after 2 years of constant use. A similar system has been used around the world, most notably by the Incas of Peru, a country where subsistence farmers still use the tactic today, albeit on a much larger scale. Social hierarchy went as such. Serfs and freemen, who we'll talk about later, traded labor for protection from knights, who traded loyalty and military service for protection from powerful nobles, who traded loyalty and service for land from the king. Although this may seem like a good life, it wasn't always so great for the serfs and peasants, the lowest level of the system. Serfs were peasants who lived and worked on the lord's manor. They couldn't leave without the lord's permission or marry. Lords had to protect serfs from outside dangers, barbarians in particular. Serfs and peasants lived a very harsh life, with long hours spent raising crops, feeding livestock, and feeding and clothing their families. They died young due to a bad diet, no access to medicine, and malnutrition. In fact, they had a life expectancy of about 35 years, less than half of what we have today in America. It was based primarily on heredity. If your parents were a serf, you were a serf, and so too would your kids be serfs. Peasants paid taxes to use the mill and bakery and paid a tithe to a priest, a payment that was about 1/10 of a peasant's income. They lived in crowded cottages with dirt floors and straw for beds. Freemen, however, were slightly different. They were skilled workers who paid rent to the nobles and lords, and they could leave the manor. Examples of freemen include blacksmiths and millers. Although feudalism got its start in Western Rome, it never really took hold and became very popular until King William the Conqueror used it to reward the Normans for helping him take England. At that point, manorialism and feudalism had similar amounts of usage, as there were only slight differences between the two systems. Manorialism was slightly more complicated and relied a little more on the fertility of the land. The age of feudalism and manorialism came to an end, however, when the Black Death swept through Europe in the middle of the 14th century, decaying the hold of nobles on peasants and wiping out a large number of said peasants and nobles. In all, the plague killed about a third of Europe's population. The plague caused the expansion of a market-oriented system that majorly reduced the need for feudalism. All of this led to the Peasant Revolt of 1381, which is the end of the once great system.